Scripture reading this morning comes from a familiar passage of Genesis, one we've been reflecting on a little bit over the last few weeks. Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 18. The first 18 verses of Genesis chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took two of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." May God add his blessing to our reading of his word this morning.
You'll see, beginning on page 4 of your bulletin, an outline of the message if you'd like to follow along. As Mark indicated, we're looking at a passage that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, but we're looking at it from a completely different perspective. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, we focused on the idea that in Isaac we have a type of Jesus, and that the story is in one sense a living parable of what Jesus was going to do on the cross thousands of years later. But today we're looking at it in its own right, that it's not simply a parable, but it was an historical event that happened to living people. And I'm going to suggest to you this morning that in the story of Abraham and his being commanded to offer Isaac up as a sacrifice, we have here a description of what each one of us goes through when we are called to make a sacrifice for God. Now, some of the sacrifices we're called to offer are smaller sacrifices. Some of them, like Abraham offers here, are huge sacrifices. But in the small ones and in the large ones, there are steps that God leads us through. And we're going to go this morning through your outline looking at the steps that God led Abraham through and the steps that he leads us through in calling us to make sacrifices for him. What is a sacrifice? What is it to make a sacrifice for God? When have you been called to make a sacrifice? What was your response? Christians in other parts of the world understand that sacrifice is the essence of the Christian faith. To be a Christian is to live a life of sacrifice. We've forgotten this in many places in the West. We've forgotten what sacrifice is. But you talk to Christians in South America, they understand sacrifice. You talk to Christians in Africa, they understand what sacrifice is. Christians in Asia understand what sacrifice is. But in many churches in the West, in North America, and Europe, we've become comfortable in our faith and we've forgotten what sacrifice is. I remember a few years ago, Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners Community in Washington, was interviewed. And the interviewer said to him at one point, "Many people call you a radical Christian. What is your response to that?" And he kind of smiled and he said, "Well, I'm not a radical Christian." He said, "In fact, I'm a very average, mediocre Christian. It's just that Christianity in the United States has become so watered down that even a mediocre Christian looks radical." And if we're going to follow God's call, I want to suggest to you that we need to get back to an understanding of sacrifice and what it is and what God calls us to do. The question for you is, do you love God? Do you love Him more than anyone and anything else? Are you willing to sacrifice anything for God? That's the essence of sacrifice. And we see the process of making a sacrifice in the story of Abraham and Isaac. We're going to go through this verse by verse. Look first at the first two verses. The first thing you have to do when considering this idea of sacrifice is to, number one, step one, face God's demand for absolute sacrifice, His highest demand. Face it. To recognize that God is calling you to make a sacrifice. Chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, and notice what He does here. He doesn't gloss over what Abraham's being called to do. In fact, you might even say He's rubbing it in a little bit. He says, "Take your son." He could have left it there, but He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." He demanded of Abraham that he make a sacrifice for him. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are times in your life, not just one or two, but many times in your life, that God will demand of you a sacrifice. And the first thing that you and I as believers need to do is to face that demand, to come to terms with what God is asking us to do. This was simply one of many crises that God brought Abraham through. He demanded that he leave his homeland, all that was familiar to him. He demanded that he wait patiently for God to provide him with a son. He demanded that God turn his son Ishmael over to him when he went off with his mother into the wilderness. And there are many, many others. In fact, probably next year, I'm going to preach another message on this passage and talk about it from that perspective. But the point this morning is to face the fact that God makes demands of us. Jesus himself said, and I don't know how he could put it any more bluntly than this, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. I don't know how Jesus could put it any clearer than that. See, what Jesus was after, what God was after, was not Abraham's son, but Abraham's heart. He wanted him to unconditionally sacrifice his life to him. Now, you may be wondering why Russell is up here. You may have thought that he just wanted a good seat for the message. But no, I've asked Isaac. Isaac wasn't available. So I asked Russell if he would come forward. And at each point in our message, he's going to talk about a sacrifice that God called him to make, a kind of illustration of what we're talking about here. So I'm going to ask him some questions. And the first question is simply, Russell, can you talk to us about a time when God called you to make a sacrifice and what that sacrifice was?
Well, when Richard asked me about doing this, the first question wasn't, what am I going to say? The first question was, which sacrifice should I talk about? Because the Lord definitely asks sacrifices every day. But the one event that I chose to use as my material today was before my years at First Baptist. I was a member of a little community church in Stony Creek. We had about 20 to 30 people out for church, varying, and I was very active within that church. It was my home church. I grew up in it. My family was in it, all my neighbors, relatives. I knew everybody. I was comfortable in the church. God started telling me that he was done with me in Stony Creek. He wanted me elsewhere. And that was where my sacrifice began.
So the first thing Russell had to do was to face the fact that God was calling him to make a sacrifice. And that is the first step for each of us. But then it comes the second step. And step number 2 is think through the sacrifice. Think through it. One of the ways that we can tell whether God is calling us to do something or whether the evil one is calling us to do something is if we have time to think about it. Usually God will give us time to consider a command. But with Satan, he wants us to act immediately. He'll say, don't think about it, don't dwell on it, just do it. He'll try and get us to act rashly. But God gives us time to consider. Notice in verses 3 and 4. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Now notice this. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. When God commanded Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, he could have said very easily, do it right here. Instead, he sent Abraham on a 3-day journey. What must that have been like? For Abraham, 3 days and 2 nights contemplating the fact that God had commanded him to kill his son. Can you imagine the thoughts that were going through Abraham's head? How could God tell me to offer my son as a sacrifice? I thought God said murder was wrong. I don't know if I can do this. Maybe I'll say to God, kill me instead. Let me be the sacrifice and let my son live. What about God's promise that he was going to raise up a nation through my son? what about the oath that he made? How will I ever tell Sarah what I've done? She'll hate me. This will kill her. Why? 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 For 3 days, God had Abraham ponder this demand that he was placing on him. Now, there's an extremely important point I want you to follow here. And that point is this. Even as Abraham was debating with himself and asking all these questions and trying to find answers, even during that 3-day period, he was obedient. He walked towards the mountain that God had commanded him to go to. He didn't say, I've got to get this all worked out, and then once it's all worked out in my mind, then maybe I'll follow him. He asked the questions, he sought the answers, but he was obedient through the process. God gives us time to wrestle through these issues when he calls us to be obedient. But he wants us to be obedient in the meantime. Remember last month when I presented to you the Spark Challenge? Remember what I said to you? I said, take these home. Pray about it. Talk to your spouse. Talk to your significant other. Don't make a rash decision. Ask God what he wants you to commit to. I didn't want anybody just checking everything off and saying, okay, I'm going to do all that. I wanted it to be the result of prayer. That's the process that God brings Abraham through here as well. And so, Russell, when you heard God calling you to make that sacrifice, what thoughts went through your head as you were trying to process all that?
Well, of course, the initial thought that went through my head is, you got to be kidding. I'm comfortable here. This is my home church. My family's here. But the Lord kept telling me, Russell, I'm telling you, I'm done with you here. I need you somewhere else. You have young children, and my children were all fairly young at the time. There's no activities for them here. I need you in a church where your kids are going to get ministered to. I need you in a church where you're going to get ministered to in a different way. And so there was a lot of mixed feelings and arguing back and forth between myself and the Lord.
Now, step number 3 has to do with the power that God gives us to respond to his commands. And that power is found in one word: trust. Trust God and his power to raise up and use the sacrifice. Look at the trust that Abraham shows here beginning in verse 5. He said to his servants, this is verse 5, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. Now notice the first person plural pronoun. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. See the trust. He doesn't know how God's going to work it out, but he trusts that God is going to work it out. He trusts that somehow God is going to honor the covenant that he had made with Abraham. And he goes on, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, and see the trust here as well, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. You see, it's where trust comes in. And this is why we emphasized through September this Spark initiative. Because trust doesn't come overnight. Trust comes as we deepen our relationship. And those habits, those patterns, those disciplines that we described here, the fasting, the Bible reading, the prayer, the meditation, the financial stewardship, all of those habits help us to deepen our relationship with God so that we have a trust that will enable us to respond to the sacrifices that He calls us to make. And Abraham is commended for this. The scriptures say in Romans, Abraham did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what He had promised. Russell, when you were contemplating God's demand for you, what role did trust play?
Trust was a complete decision, reason for my decision. Because at that point in time, this all didn't transpire overnight. This was over several months and maybe even years leading up to it. But by this time, the Lord was making it clear that He wanted me at First Baptist. I didn't know why. I couldn't imagine why He would want me here. I thought, well, it's a nice big church. Maybe it's a place I can hide. Lots of people, I can just sneak in and listen to God's word and then sneak out. Well, it didn't work that way. As many of you know, I've been called into a number of ministry opportunities here. But if I hadn't have trusted that God was leading me in the right direction, I had to surrender all and say, Lord, I'll go. You show me what to do.
Step 4 is where the rubber hits the road. It's where we follow through on the sacrifice. Listen to verses 9 and 10. When they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. He was ready to offer him as a sacrifice to God. And that, as I said, is where the rubber hits the road. That is what these disciplines are all about, so that when you come to the point of having to make a decision for God, to follow Him in whatever sacrifice He's calling you to, that you trust Him enough to respond positively. But the question you'll be confronted with is this: do you love God more than anything else? Are you willing to sacrifice yourself to God and for His cause? Are you willing to sacrifice everything to God, to actually give God everything, your life and your possessions? Are you willing to obey God totally, no matter what the cost? Are you sold out for Jesus completely, absolutely surrendered to God? That's what God demands. Jesus Himself said, and this is one of the most disturbing sentences in all of Scripture, but Jesus Himself said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." What's He talking about there? He's talking about obedience. In Luke 14, Jesus said, and again, I don't know how He could get any clearer, but He said, "In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples." You remember the story, the parable that Jesus told of the two sons. The father says to the first son, "Go into the vineyard and pick grapes for me." And the first son says, "Yes, I will," but then he decides not to go. He says to his second son, go into the vineyard and pick grapes for me. The second son says, I'm not going to go. But then he changes his mind and he goes. And then Jesus asks, which of the two sons obeyed their father? And the people responded, the second son. And Jesus said, you have answered correctly. It's not enough to have good intentions. It's not enough to go part way in our commitment. God is looking for people who are completely sold out to Him. People who will follow Him no matter what the cost, no matter what the conditions. Now, I'll be honest with you. I'm preaching this message to myself because I've spent a lot of time on Genesis 22, basically preparing 3 messages, 2 of which I'm preaching now, 1 of which I'll probably preach sometime next year. I've spent a lot of time in Genesis 22. And the question that God has asked me over and over again is, how would I have responded to this challenge, to this command? I'm a father of a boy who may have been about Isaac's age at that time. I'm not sure I would have passed that test. In fact, a large part of me says I wouldn't have. I don't think I could have done it. I don't think I could have offered my son as a sacrifice even if God commanded it. I don't think I would have passed. But this is what God demands. This is what He commands for us to follow Him completely. Not everyone, He says, who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Russell, what happened with you when God called you to follow through?
Through all of this, as God was calling me, I kept making excuses, reasons why I needed to stay in Stony Creek. When it boiled down to it, it was just more convenient. And as the Lord and I struggled back and forth, it came to a point where He was telling me that I was a hindrance to Stony Creek. And I could see it, that the longer I stayed there, the more turmoil it seemed to cause. Not that there was conflict between any of us there, but I could tell God's word was not being presented and not being absorbed the way it should be because I was refusing to do what the Lord wanted me to do. So when it came to that, I said, Lord, I can't be the reason for the downfall of the church if you're calling me elsewhere. And I finally accepted His call to move.
Now, when you offer the sacrifice, it doesn't end there. The last 2 steps are the fun ones. Step number 5, experience God's acceptance and provision. Look what happens beginning in verse 11. Remember, Abraham has the knife up over his head. He's waiting to bring it down onto his son. But in verse 11, the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. And just as at the very beginning, he rubbed in the fact that I want you to offer your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. He does the same thing here out of his obedience. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. It's when we follow God in obedience to his command, no matter what that command is, that we experience his acceptance and his provision. Russell, can you talk about what you experienced from God when you followed him in obedience?
Well, once I responded to God's call, and I presented all my resignations to the church of all the offices and committees I was on. And I called my mother and I told her. And of course, everything I feared started to happen. Everyone was upset with me, especially my mom. And I said, Lord, what have you asked me to do? My mom is upset, thinks I'm walking away from you. But I kept praying about it. And it wasn't too many weeks afterwards that my mom called me up. And she said, Russell, says, I realize why you did what you did. And she actually shared with me that the Lord was doing the same thing in her life, was calling her elsewhere, and she has since moved to the Hillsborough Church where she needed to be fed. But once I responded to God to come here, the peace that came over me is unexplainable. Everything fell into place. We were greeted by people who cared. My kids got involved in youth ministries and activities. Every time a need arose, the Lord provided. You all know that I lost my wife a few years ago, that we had a 10-year struggle with cancer. Well, no matter what happened, whether it was a financial issue that we wondered where that bill was going to be paid, the money came in. There were people handed us envelopes, said, here, use this where you need it, not knowing what our situation was. We were in Halifax one summer when she was having her transplant, and parking's at a premium down there. So I left my vehicle home and lived in the hospital. Whenever I needed to come to do business at home, it was just a phone call, and someone from the church was there to bring me home and take me back. Whether it was just someone to talk to, or people that could tell that you needed a kind word, the Lord brought them to us. He ministered to myself and all of my family. And if I hadn't responded with the yes to the Lord, I hate to think what condition I'd be in now, because I definitely am rewarded for the sacrifice we made to come here.
And finally, step number 6, allow God's promises to renew your heart. Notice in verses 15 to 18, because Abraham was obedient, listen to what God says to him. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Again, it's not enough to say, Lord, Lord. Why did these blessings come upon Abraham? The last phrase there, because you have obeyed me. God is looking for people who will sell out to him, who will follow him completely. And it's in those sacrifices. And again, some of them are small, some are medium, and some are huge. But it's in those sacrifices that we face in life that God determines whether he can use us or not. I'm going to issue a couple of challenges to you. Just before I do, though, I want to thank Russell for being here today and give him a chance to say some last comments on this final point.
But as I was saying, though, that if the Lord asks you to make a sacrifice, no matter how big or how small, respond to Him in a positive way. Because even the little things are worked out. Because after we came to First Baptist, the Lord showed us He wanted us to put our house up for sale and showed us a house that He wanted us to buy that was a lot closer. It's in Lower Coverdale. And once we bought it, we found out that one of our neighbors are Bill and Linda Kerwin. Now, don't hold that against me, but but no, they have been wonderful neighbors, wonderful church families. And so the Lord works out even the little things for His honor and His glory. So if He's calling you to do something, no matter how big or small, my advice to you is respond to the Lord, what He wants you to do.
Again, Russell, thank you very much for speaking to us so honestly today. We appreciate you doing this. And I want to challenge you, again, when God calls us to make sacrifices, the question is, are we ready to hear His voice, and have we prepared ourselves, or better yet, allowed God's Spirit to prepare us to respond in a positive way? In September, I introduced this emphasis called Spark. We started off this month, Spark Your Life. Now, September is over. Today is the first Sunday in October. My challenge for you is not to let this fall to the bottom of your bookshelf. We have extra copies of this. If you want to pick up a new one, you can on your way out. If you want to go on our website, firstmoncton.com, you can download it along with some explanatory items. But take this, and my challenge is what you've done in September, carry that over now through October and November up to the beginning of Advent, which is the first Sunday in December. One of the mistakes I've made in my time as a pastor here is I've dichotomized too much of what happens in the church. For example, we'll have a stewardship emphasis, and then we don't talk about it. And then we have a prayer emphasis, and then we don't talk about it. And then a fasting emphasis, and we don't talk about it. And by doing that, these habits, these disciplines, these patterns of living never become a part of the fabric of our congregation and the fabric of our lives. And that's what they need to become. And that's why I'm challenging you to prepare yourself for God's demands by taking this. Take a new one if you want. If your old one's all marked up, take a new one and say, okay, I did this much in September. What is it that God's calling me to do in October and November? Carry it over, build on it. If for one reason or another you didn't participate in Spark in September, start now. Take this home with you, download it off the internet, and say, Lord, I want to be ready when you call me to make a sacrifice. I want to be sold out for you. I don't want to be a half-hearted believer, a half-hearted Christian. I don't want to be like everyone else. I want my faith to be all that you want it to be. It's no coincidence that we're talking about this on Communion Sunday, because what we're talking about here is the essence of what the Lord's Supper is all about. When you take the bread and when you drink the cup, you are remembering the sacrifice that God made for you, that Jesus made for you, and you're offering your body as a living sacrifice for Him. Remember what Paul said in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. It's my life verse. In view of God's mercy, I beseech you, my brothers, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to Him. It's what the Christian faith is all about. It's when we celebrate this meal in just a few minutes, we're not just remembering what Jesus did for us, significant as that is. we're offering our lives as a sacrifice for Him.